Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Q&A for the HBO documentary series, All Be Gone in the Dark. My name is Chris Lemaire, and I'm a programmer at the American Cinematheque. And I'm very happy to present this conversation that includes the creator, Liz Garbus, director, Elizabeth Wolff, and two of the executive producers, as well as subjects of the series, Patton Oswalt and Paul Haynes. The Q&A is moderated by Matt Zoller Seitz, who is the editor-at-large at rogerebert.com and also the TV critic for New York Magazine. Before we start, I just want to send a big thank you to HBO for partnering with us on this event and also providing our members an exclusive sneak peek of the new special episode. The original series is streaming now on HBO Max, and the special episode is set to premiere on June 21st. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy the conversation.
So for starters, Liz, can you tell us where the production of this episode falls within the context of the rest of the series? When and what were some of the factors in deciding to do it?
Well, we had always, and when I say we, Elizabeth and I and our team, making I'll Be Gone in the Dark, and of course in our conversations with Patton and Paul, had always been really interested in the case of Kathy Lombardo. This was the white whale for Michelle. It was a case that it was an unsolved murder that took place in her very quiet neighborhood while she was growing up. And she attributed it as kind of giving her the itch, an initial itch for, or let's call it a real discomfort with letting an unsolved crime stay unsolved. And we kept on, Elizabeth and I, we kept on trying to put it in the original series in the 6 hours. But it was a rich, complicated story, and it required a sort of detour that we couldn't quite fit in those 6 hours. So we always sort of treasured it and tried to figure out what to do. We had shot some of the material for the main series. We were interested in doing more. And then after Joseph DeAngelo was sentenced and we were able to see the survivors and their impact statements, it occurred to us that these stories were indeed still united, not just in Michelle's interest in both of them, but in survivors' need to testify and kind of reclaim their story and own the narrative. So Elizabeth and an amazing team, unearthed not just the details that we could find in the Lombardo case, but of another survivor to a linked case who hadn't talked before. And you see the kind of the ways in which these it is interwoven with the larger themes of I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which is about survivors and taking charge of the narrative, and of course, an intrepid, dedicated investigator in Michelle McNamara.
Patton, I wondered if you could hop in the time machine for a second and put this in a personal context for us. The Lombardo case, this story predates Michelle's fascination with and dedication to solving these unsolved crimes, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was one of those, unlike in films and even novelistic narratives, there's never that eureka moment where someone is clearly set on the path. This was a thing that happened when Michelle was a teenager, and she remembers it very vividly. Remembers, the ripple effect in the house as the news spread through the neighborhood. But it was one of those things that was kind of stored in the back of her teenage brain. And then as she grew into her 20s and 30s and was trying to be a novelist and then a screenwriter and developing TV shows, it then ended up very subtly shaping what she was doing in terms of, her other work. And then she realized, oh, wait a minute, this is the kind of narrative that I want to pursue. This is the kind of, puzzle solving. And then like what Liz and Elizabeth did, linking it to much bigger themes in life, like surviving trauma, like what do events in your life, how do they affect you? How do they change who you are? How do they affect your destiny? Not to get too big in it. So, I just love the fact that she really embraced the fact that sometimes the thing that determines your life can happen a long time ago and it doesn't immediately change your life. It doesn't happen till later. And that was really amazing how she embraced that. And I think that especially this episode, kind of shows that really brilliantly.
For the benefit of anybody who's going to be coming into this conversation cold, I just want to summarize the circumstances of this case. And if I get anything wrong, obviously tell me.
Mhm.
But Kathleen Lombardo was found murdered and sexually assaulted in 1984 in
Yes.
Oak Park, Illinois, correct?
Yes.
And then there was another attack in the vicinity of Grace Buccetti, who is talked about in this special. She survived, and I believe she was stabbed in the neck. Is that right?
Yeah, Grace's attack was one of 4 attacks in the fall of 1982 that subsequently were felt linked to Lombardo's murder.
And Lombardo was in 84.
That is correct.
Okay. And I wonder if we can talk about Paul, since this is your specialty here, these unsolved cases. One of the things that struck me watching the original series, and again watching this, is that the way that technology and law enforcement have changed and our awareness of unsolved cases and what the idea of an unsolved case has changed. Can you speak to that a little bit over the length of time?
Sure. Well, I think forensic genealogy is a really powerful tool that we're just seeing in its infancy. Since Golden State Killer in 2018, only like 150 cases have been resolved with forensic genealogy. It seems like a high number, but it's really not. And it's remarkable given the fact that DNA didn't materialize until the 80s, that some of these agencies had the foresight to preserve forensic evidence. And we just saw a case from 1956 solved with forensic genealogy, and that's become the oldest cold case yet solved with this tool. So a case like Kathleen Lombardo's has really been lost to time, and had Michelle McNamara not found this her entry point. I mean, this was really the match that lit the fire for Michelle. And if Michelle were not associated with this case, we wouldn't be talking about it. There are so many cases from that area that have completely languished and are just not discussed. So I think it's really, it comes down to the individual agency. There's a problem, I think, with Cook County and cold cases that neighboring DuPage County doesn't seem to share. Neighboring DuPage County just solved a 1975 murder that some had speculated might be linked to Kathleen Lombardo. I think now we recognize that it wasn't. So it comes down to the agencies, and the agencies' level of commitment and their resources determine what challenges are in front of these cases.
I think of myself as a fairly cynical guy, but even I was shocked by the sense that is conveyed in the series and again in this episode, that a lot of these crimes go unsolved because the police just don't care, or they botch the evidence, or at a certain point they just decide to let it go, I guess.
And when they refuse to discuss these cold cases, citing that they're open investigations, I suspect they just don't want to acknowledge their faults. And I think that's what's going on right now with Oak Park.
I was going to say, now tell us about, there were freedom of information requests were filed and they were denied. Is that right?
Yeah, we've in the course of our 3 years in production, we filed a number of freedom of information requests. And actually before that, Chris Lombardo, Kathy's brother, had also filed his own freedom of information requests. And in all those cases, Oak Park rejected those requests, citing that the investigation was ongoing, and even saying so far as that they were, submitting other materials to be tested. But they have not been forthcoming. They have not shared any information. And then actually when Chris Lombardo did get a chance to go speak with the cold case detective assigned to the case, the guy basically just said, we don't have the resources. Like, there are plenty of things that I could think of to do, but we just don't have the resources. And so now the production, along with Chris Lombardo, has filed a lawsuit to get access to some of those case files in the hopes that there are leads there that can help advance the case, and to compel Oak Park to prove in a court of law what they're doing to keep the case ongoing and open.
That was going to be my next question, is when the police say, we can't give you any information because it's an ongoing investigation, is there any burden of proof on them to prove that they're actually doing any investigating?
Well, that's what we're looking forward to in July.
If I could just jump in really quick, what Paul was talking about earlier, this is what's also frustrating about some of the stonewalling that police departments do. The 4 related cases, which were attacks, they were attacks that I don't think they resulted in deaths. Am I correct in saying that, Paul? That's correct.
Yeah.
Michelle was always going on about sometimes, not sometimes, a lot of times, these killers, they don't just start with a murder and then it leads to a series of more murders. There are ramp ups to the actual moment when they decide to finally kill someone. And if you pay more attention to these unsolved attacks, a lot of times you can track these people. And she was like, I don't know. She goes, I don't want to get into like Minority Report pre-crime stuff but if there was somehow a system to track and being able to recognize a killer ramping up and honing his MO, we could maybe stop some of these people before they get to the killing part. If we can start recognizing the signs of someone who is building up their courage to become a killer, which is what happens with a lot of these people.
Yeah, I think John Douglas's career was largely predicated on building such a system. Yeah.
Joseph,
I would also say, sorry, that Kathleen Lombardo's attack really is an aborted sexual assault. She fought back. What we were able to glean from what we have been able to see about the case is that she fought back, and that was consistent with her personality, according to her brother Chris Lombardo, and that this guy wasn't, I think, seeking to kill somebody. He was a sexual. He was a rapist, and it went wrong for him in the alley that day, and so then he killed Kathy.
If I'm remembering this right, now wasn't Joseph James D'Angelo, when you look at the totality of his crimes, that was what happened. What Patton was talking about. That he started with breaking and entering, right?
D'Angelo was a case study in escalation. Beginning as a peeping Tom, as an adolescent, graduating onto cap burglary and rape, and then ultimately homicide.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Can we talk about the actual physical production of this episode? Now, was this shot and put together substantially after the regular run?
Yeah, entirely.
Yeah,
entirely.
Well,
okay.
we had shot some stuff in Oak Park in the regular run, right? We had shot some material about some neighborhood material and some material in the vicinity, but our team went back under COVID complications to shoot this episode, to finish this episode.
Mm-hmm.
It was an interesting production. Also, Elizabeth was having a baby who came in February, like the week before we turned in the rough cut, and all the kind of things. Baby Lillian has joined us in the world.
Wait a minute, we have a production baby?
We have a production baby.
We have a production baby, yes! Awesome.
Elizabeth, now is Lillian's time to make her first, recorded entrance on.
Oh, yeah.
Patton could show her how you walk in and steal a scene.
Well, unfortunately, fortunately, she's napping right now and is in good hands, so we can have this talk. But it was the production was incredibly challenging in terms of how to do this with a pandemic and how to do this. I was not traveling because of the pandemic and the pregnancy, but it was incredible what production techniques we could use. I was beamed into a number of the interviews via Zoom, was FaceTiming into a number of the shoots that we were doing outdoors in the snow, and makes you realize how much you can do remotely. And then some of the substantial interviews that we had done with Chris Lombardo, filming in the summertime. These were all things that we had done during the original production. So it was a matter of sort of weaving all of this in, and then also revisiting Michelle's archive. I mean, Michelle was our supreme leader in all of this. We weren't investigators. We were telling the story of Michelle's investigation, and we followed her breadcrumbs, and we followed her notes, and really this is her investigation in this episode. And it's kind of one last boots on the ground with her, which was really so satisfying.
You mentioned that there was going to be more of this in the original run of the series. I'm guessing that didn't happen for time or pacing or something.
more pacing than time. It was really, as I was saying before, I mean, it really was a complicated story. And while we did include some of the cases that Michelle had been really interested in leading up to the Irons, to the GSK, this case felt like it just deserved its own plot. I mean, it was a special case for her, and it felt like it deserved its own moments. And we just couldn't, as we were sort of building the trajectory of the GSK and of getting to know Michelle, we just never found the place for it. But we knew we wanted to come back to it. And then, again, it's not just Lombardo, it's also the survivors who we got to know so well in the main series, who we come back to now that, this man has been, sentenced, getting their reactions. And, it was fascinating to understand how that kind of closure does or doesn't provide healing. And I think it does in some ways, but also it's, he took something that will never come back to them.
Along that line, Liz, I wondered if we could revisit the subject of the representation of atrocities when you're retelling this sort of story. This is something that you and I have addressed previously, but I wanted to get it on record again here because I really feel like it's key to the whole thing. The ethics and philosophy of representing violence.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, as Elizabeth said, Michelle was our North Star, and Michelle was always survivor focused. And, she was able to dig into those stories. And of course, she was searching for this killer. She wanted him to be brought to justice, but she ultimately knew, and she has this great quote, that at the end of the day, what's interesting is not this guy. He's just some guy, as she wrote, Joe or Bob. He's just some pasty old, usually white man who does these crimes, right? Ultimately, what she was most interested in was understanding the survivors and what they had gone through. So we use that as our North Star. And in terms of the violence in the series, in the violence of these crimes, we took an approach, Elizabeth, the other directors, and our DP, of really trying to evoke the feeling of the terror without showing it. We were, certainly did not want to be part of re-traumatizing anybody. And also, stylistically, it was a way to enter this mystery and not have the point of view of the killer. I mean, I'm going to say it better. Oftentimes in these series, the point of view of the killer is what the camera is representing. And we turned that around, and we wanted it to be from the point of view of the survivors and the victims, and sort of deprioritize that face, that point of view. And so, the recreations that we shot and the photos, the crime scene photos that we shot, were meant to kind of evoke the emotional warpath from the survivor point of view, as opposed to the salacious, twisted longing of the perpetrator's point of view.
Liz, and also Elizabeth, I wonder if you could talk about just sort of the boots on the ground aspect of that. How do you actually represent that in terms of directing, shooting, editing?
Well, something that we came up with our DP early on was, how are we going to film from the point of view of these survivors being woken up in the middle of the night? And something that we played with was this sort of camera angle. The camera is turning, and it's the moment when sort of their lives are completely turned upside down. And that married with thinking, really being very deliberate with the score, making sure that a lot of these times in these TV shows, like, the score is from the point of view of the perpetrators, arousal,
escalation, arousal.
Yeah, that's right. And we pulled that back. We said, okay, well, this is actually when you talk to survivors, when they describe what this is happening, like, they're hearing the sounds of their home, like or it goes very silent, and we really spent a lot of time of, how do you rewrite this story from their point of view, visually, from a sound perspective, and then and then not do the same sort of filmic tropes of, the flashlight and the point of view of the perpetrator. And we did that both in this special episode and with Grace Puccetti's story as she's walking home in the snow, which was a coincidence that we got to film in a snowstorm, and it worked out very well, actually. And then with the survivors in the series.
I mean, you're never going to see a door open, and see a couple in bed, right? You're never going to see that shot in this series. And that's like, I think, the most elemental way of explaining how we wanted the point of view to operate in this show.
A lot of times, unfortunately, these documentaries, without meaning to, make the killer into this dark anti-hero that it's on us to try to understand, rather than understand the victims and understand the hunters and the people that are trying to bring some justice. And it really goes into what they were saying about how Michelle was their North Star. That essay, that letter to an old man at the end of her book about, you used to be the one looking into windows, and now windows are opening up all around you. And Liz and Elizabeth were opening up the windows around this guy and making him the one who was being observed. And that was so, so crucial visually and narratively.
A lot of true crime content really is exploitative, and I think functions just as primitive entertainment. So it was really important to have someone like Liz, who doesn't come from that framework, to sort of transcend the genre the way that Michelle's book did.
Yeah. One of my favorite things thank you, by the way, and one of my favorite things that Patton says in the series is, once we understood who D'Angelo was, like we understand he had a traumatic childhood, et cetera, and his survivors went through this extraordinary trauma as well, and they chose healing, they chose community, they chose a path, and he chose, and he chose a very different one. They were all trauma survivors, right? But there was a path that he went on that was available to those survivors, right? They could have been filled with rage and hatred and violence, but in fact, they chose something else. And it's very beautiful to have gone along that journey. I mean, we were so lucky that when we started making this series, D'Angelo was arrested the first day of shooting. We were all together, all of us in Chicago. And so we were really able to see that journey through the survivor's eyes of like, oh my God, like this thing that has been, has killed my soul. I'm still alive, but there's an emptiness in here is finally kind of coming to light. And with us being able to talk about it and take the shame away from yourself and put it back on him where it belongs.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I just got asked in an interview the other day about like the shame factor of interviewing someone like Grace talking about her sexual assault. And I was just like, no, the shame is not Grace's. Yeah. Grace's was walking home from ballet. Grace was, she was doing, and the shame is elsewhere. And I think that's also a big message of this series is that, is to put that blame back where it belongs, not on the survivors who are so resilient.
There's a comedian that they made a documentary about, Lucky, Barry Crimmins, and he said something so interesting because he's a survivor of sexual abuse. When he was a small child, he was molested, and he was like, I'm so sick of people saying they are admitting to being a sexual abuse victim. It's like, I'm not admitting anything. I'm telling you what happened to me. I didn't do anything wrong. So you need to change that language of I'm admitting you. Why are you saying that about us? Like that always stuck with me. And it really, like you just said, really applied to this.
Mm-hmm. When I was watching the portions of this episode that are about the sentencing of D'Angelo, I was thinking about the trauma of all of these victims and particularly what they must be thinking watching this unfold. And the moment when he says, I'm really sorry to everyone I've hurt, I wanted to know from each of you, what do you think about that? Do you think it's possible for a guy like that to be sorry? Do you think there could be anything sincere there? And if there is, does it even matter at this point? What are your feelings? I mean, just collectively.
I was fascinated by his apology statement because at first it appeared impenetrable, and every time I watched it, it resonated differently. But my suspicion is that that was motivated by a narcissistic need to be in control of the situation. And to show that he wasn't the coward that he was being portrayed as. Throughout most of the proceedings, he assumed this catatonic state to project, I think, a lack of culpability. And in that moment, he was simply controlling the narrative. And I think it was pretty hollow.
It sounded like he was mimicking what he had heard other people say in TV, movie, novel depictions of a villain apologizing. It was just, he was trying to mimic what human behavior is. And like Paul said, he had done I'm just this frail old man, but when it came time to speak, you notice he suddenly stood up straight and his voice was clear, like, I tried to use the frail old man thing and that didn't work, so boom. Like, it's it's no different to me than that moment when Harvey Weinstein left the court after being sentenced and just openly took his walker and just tossed it aside, like, well, that didn't work, and then just strode into his SUV. And like, it's just it's so transparent and blatant what these people do.
And it was a transformation that was so dramatic. I can't imagine D'Angelo wasn't aware of the power of his physicality changing.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to diminish it at all, but it made me think of the process of making amends. When people go through recovery and they make amends for things they did that were bad in the past. And I always wonder, like, how different people react to basically an apology tour. Like, there are probably some people who are really, really happy for that person that they've, in theory, changed themselves. And there are probably some other people who are just like, they won't even open the door. It's like, I don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
To me, it was enraging, actually. I mean, and I'm just responding not as not like from a sociological perspective, but just as a human, because if you're able to say you're sorry and we're to believe that you mean that, it means that you have some moral compass. And if you have a moral compass, then you know what you did in some ways was destructive beyond, probably generations trickling down and exponentially destructive to families. So, I wish I believed that catatonic crazy man, but I don't. So yeah, that was my reaction.
Is a moral compass something that can be acquired if you don't already have it? I'm not trying to be a jerk here. I really truly wonder that.
I don't know. That's so outside of my wheelhouse. I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example of someone who found one, but I don't know. It always seems like, especially when people have these conversions or these, religious conversions, whatever, it's ultimately to their advantage. It's not to, well, I'm going to like give whatever money or to my victims. It's always like, it's almost this unspoken, well, look, I managed to grow from it. And if you can't, then I guess, that's just your problem. Like, it's still, like Paul said, it's a friggin' power play every time.
These are profoundly self-centered people that commit offenses like this. So while they might develop something closer to a moral compass than they had 30 years prior, they're still selfishly motivated.
And I think that the relief that the survivors got, at least the ones that we spoke to, was less about him speaking, but more just this chapter of the adjudication process being over, and that they don't need to constantly be reliving it in terms of, if he was on death row, all the different hearings that they would have to go to. They just wanted to close this chapter and to just know that he was behind bars and that he was never coming out, and that they never needed to do anything in the legal process again. And that to them was an amount of closure and allowed them to feel a great weight had been lifted off, not his apology or his speaking out.
Well, yeah, in fact, what he said was irrelevant. What was important was what they got to say. And,
yes.
Many of them, who are in our series, their rapes haven't been charged because it was past the statute of limitations. But part of his plea deal to avoid the death penalty was that he would have to face them and listen to them. And it goes back to the point of view of this doc, right? Like it goes back to they're owning their narratives, they are speaking out about it, and there is no shame on them. And I think that is and in speaking out, you are shedding the shame. I mean, for Grace Puccetti, for instance, she was told, like many of these survivors, to keep this quiet. But that's a way of having the cancer inside you that this perpetrator has given you. And I think in speaking in court like that and having him sit there, you're putting the cancer back where it belongs.
I'm just looking at these statistics here, and who even knows if this is, only he knows if this is an accurate number, but 13 murders, 50 rapes, and 120 different incidents of breaking and entering that we know about. And it's that we know about that kind of fascinates me here, because you've got this whole section during the sentencing where you can't show all of the, recitation of the crimes and the entering into the record, because this would be like 9 hours long. I mean, that's what a prolific evil person this guy was. And I wonder, do you think there's a possibility that did you ever get the sense that there was a Henry Lee Lucas type of situation where maybe they were throwing unsolved cases onto the pile and hoping he would confess to them so they could clear them?
These were all cases that had been linked to the series for many decades. So no.
No, okay. But that's a thing that happens in law enforcement, right?
Sure. Yeah. Henry Lee Lucas being the prime example.
Yeah. Is there any?
I guess Paul. Sorry, I'm curious. Do you think, Paul, if there are more cases will we ever know?
Mm-hmm. I think we'll never know. I think there are a lot of unanswered questions in this case, and unfortunately, it wasn't a condition of his plea agreement that he be forthcoming, as has been the case with other serial murder cases, Green River being one of them, and BTK being another. But I don't know that there are other murders that DeAngelo is responsible for. There may well be, but I don't have a high degree of confidence in that.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I said I'm sorry because it's over. Passing me the mic. Sorry.
Okay. Liz and Elizabeth, I wondered if you could talk briefly about the how you move back and forth between the Oak Park portions of the story and the sentencing. That's a very delicate operation, when to move from one part of the story to the other. And did you have any rules for that? And just in terms of process of like, why are we going here? And when do we go to the other timeline?
We kind of created that weave in the series in the first 6 episodes. And it became clear in the first few weeks of the edit that these 2 stories needed to be woven together. And God, I wish I had a good answer for this, but it's just like, I think that when you're in the edit, you feel like, okay, this is so intense. Now you need a break into this other intense story, and you sort of have a feeling in the edit, you're like, well, I need a little Michelle now. So, Michelle needs to drive us to the next point. And, that there was in many ways a very seamless handoff, because thematically this was about, the idea of getting closure for these survivors in the Golden State Killer case, but then also what it is like for people whose cases haven't been solved to not get that closure. And so that was kind of always a way to kind of go back and forth. And I think early on, I think this was actually something that you said, Liz, that it was, how could we end this with the survivors on something that was hopeful, and that it was a call to action as well, for, much the way that Michelle's book ends is like, she wrote that book not thinking that the Golden State Killer was going to get caught. And in the end, you guys do such a great job of using that email that she sends to her publisher saying like, well, how can we end this if there's going to be no resolution in the case? Can it be a call to action? Inside everyone lurks a Sherlock Holmes. And, when we were thinking about ways to end this, we knew we wanted to end it with the survivors, but we also wanted to end it with that call to action. And how best could we do that was with Michelle's words herself. So, once we knew that ending, it was kind of, we knew it sort of, the weave wrote itself.
Where does the
Oh yeah,
author-
it wrote itself. It was so easy. I think, but one thing I'll add is like those transitions, weaving in between the stories is always it's always been the challenge of a show like this. And you say, is there any rule? And I'll go back to the Supreme Court decision about pornography is, when you see it. Like if there's no rule, but it either feels right or it doesn't, and then it's a poor, and that's kind of the only rule that applies.
Patton, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about Michelle as somebody who kind of osmotically absorbed this negative energy from all of these horrible stories. I mean, this is something that's talked about in the series. And I wondered watching this, and I hope this isn't an indelicate question, but do you in some sense consider Michelle to have been one of the collateral victims of this killer?
No, I don't. I just feel like that's a little too neat. And Pat, there were other things that were going on with her, that just the pressure, not of, she had these two, the competing pressures of wanting to finish the novel and wanting to also like solve this case, but not in a glory hog kind of way. Like she kept saying, I want to be like Frances McDormand at the end of Fargo, like going to sleep, getting ready to make breakfast for my daughter the next day, but knowing that I pointed law enforcement toward so there was all that going on. And I think that she just misjudged what she was doing dosage wise. Like, she kept assuring me, I have an Adderall in the morning and then I take a little Vicodin to go to sleep. But I think she was mixing stuff and it's clear that like opioids, I think that they kind of shave the edges off of your sense of perception and proportion. And I think that also fed into it, but I just don't ascribe his whatever evil in the world to her death. I think there were other things that were going on that were way bigger than him, I think,
How, if it's possible to separate Michelle's work from Michelle in any meaningful sense, Patton, can you tell me, in what way did Michelle's work on these unsolved cases, on the issues of justice, affect your view of how the world works?
I mean, I don't want to say that it made me cynical. It made me, because I didn't want to just go, well, the system sucks and we're all screwed. It just made me look for, okay, if this area is lacking, like if this police force is lacking in terms of, knowing how to go online and search, or knowing how to, then what are the other resources that we can maybe help amplify? What are the victims advocate groups? What are the, DNA justice groups that are out there that we can then, it just really redrove home the idea that you've got to just be more involved in your community, just on a local level. And if everyone just focuses on a local level, I think that adds to the overall strength of the wider community, the bigger mass mind in a way.
Paul, do you want to jump in on that, just as somebody who focuses on the particulars of this sort of thing?
Yeah, I think Michelle's relationships with these agencies that were working these cases was pretty unique. And as we're seeing now with the Oak Park Police Department, they're not cooperating with media, and it's to their detriment. And I think the detectives that worked with Michelle and were open with her recognized the value that she brought to their investigations. And, it's much like my collaboration with Jennifer Barth, the book's editor. I have no editorial credentials. And Jennifer, who is the book's, she's an executive editor at HarperCollins, could have easily dismissed me. But she was highly collaborative and receptive to copy edits that I proposed. And it was for the good of the book. It was a partnership between someone who's a professional and someone who is more or less, an amateur. And it was very similar with Michelle and Ken Clark in Sacramento and Paul Holes in Contra Costa. And I would argue that if Michelle had never been attached to this case, it may still be unsolved.
I agree.
Liz and Elizabeth, can you speak to the way in which physically just working on this production, helping put all the pieces together, has changed you as an artist or as a person?
Elizabeth, don't jump down.
I figured I might as well go for the Hail Mary. We're near the end. You know.
Wow. I mean, I was changed in so many ways. It's really hard to begin. I started working on this in April of 2018. So this is 3 years of my full-time work on this project. And so, you know, I think I learned stuff about filmmaking and the ways in which we can push the boundaries in documentary filmmaking to tell a more narrative-driven, action-driven story. And I learned things, you know, from Michelle. I learned about, you know, the relentlessness of her pursuits, but also, you know, it was a dark place to go, the stuff that she was researching. And then it was also really sad learning about Michelle and watching sort of her through her archive working on this book and putting a lot of pressure on herself. And, you know, I kept on looking at this as like, you know, the artist as a young mom, as a, you know, the portrait of an artist as a young mom. And here we were in this production, all women, men, everyone sort of in their own sort of creative pursuits, telling and retracing these steps. And, you know, I think we went into it very early on, having very open conversations about how dark this was going to be and how could we take time for ourselves and keep tabs on each other. And, you know, it was very, it was sad. I mean, there were weeks in the edit where, you know, you were hearing somebody's survival story about a sexual assault every single day. Even, you know, thinking about just Michelle's death, you know, it was something that was really, really hard. And so we had to kind of create these systems to take care of ourselves. And I think I really learned a lot about how to do that as a team and how to do that for yourself and how to do that for others when working with such sensitive material.
I just want to say, you know, sometimes I get self-conscious doing these things. So if my answer didn't correspond exactly to your query, I apologize. My attention drifted inward for a moment. So
not at all. Not at all. No. I was a different question.
Okay.
No, oh yeah, no, it's all. No, I mean, I think Elizabeth said so much. It was an incredibly caring, cohesive team, and you know, when we were working with all the crime scene photos, and we had young, you know, archival assistants and associate producers scanning those photos. I mean, that was a lot for them, you know, and they would need air, and you know, and it was creating a space where people could talk about how they were feeling or ask for time or say, I need to go to therapy. You know, I mean, like there was a lot of that. I mean, we talked about bringing in a therapist for the team and then realized that would be super awkward for everyone to be. So, you know, but it was just very much something that we wanted to be open with the team about. And also, I mean, Patton gave us the keys to the kingdom, which was Michelle's mind. And we just wanted to take very, very, very good care of those keys and that kingdom. And that enormous trust that he put in us, I hope is reflected back in the series in terms of both, you know, an honesty about what Michelle was going through and just a huge reverence for her literary skills, her talents, her doggedness, her humanity. I never met Michelle. I relate to her so much. And as Elizabeth was saying, when we were editing the sequence of her dying and you know, working with Patton's audio, you know, kind of like, it was just like every single time I walked in that fucking edit room, I wished it would finish a different way. And we just kept on, and I was always devastated that it didn't in the fucking edit room, right? And not to mention Patton, what he has to go through. but it was, I think all of us took a great care of that kingdom, and it certainly has raised the bar on what kind of work I want to do. I mean, this was such a treasure trove of a woman's brilliance and trust from Patton, and of course trust from all of these survivors. It was very special project, and our team was so special too. So it was a really wonderful experience, which may sound weird given the subject matter, but it is this community that we formed. And sadly, Michelle was alone, right? Like, she didn't have that community that you have in filmmaking. Writing is so hard. I mean, Pat, you guys all know that. You're all writers, we're not, and so, I appreciate that a lot.
I think that's why also this special episode was so satisfying, because it was so, it was really so much of telling that the first 6 episodes was really sad. And this special episode, like, I got to kind of I just felt like I was just jamming with Michelle the whole time. Like there was a part of this where you felt like, okay, we're on the ground with Michelle, like we're back in action, we're in Oak Park, and I think, I think for anyone that's watched the series, it'll be just be a wonderful last hurrah. So.
All right, well, we're out of time. Thank you to everybody who participated, and thanks to American Cinematheque for making this happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.